system, a geography. And so that's just to help you understand and explain a little bit more about the term Giiweo and Chagewin. It's really to make things right by doing it right. And to do that, we also have to correct whatever is wrong. And we have to set it up right and set it up justly, so that all interests will be served, and any issues, injustices in there can be corrected. The reason I talk about this is that my experience in education and the era that we're in, a reconciliation, it doesn't seem like there's any direction. There's no real vision what real reconciliation look like. There's no real what we would call a work plan on how we're going to achieve these things. And that work plan, without the vision and a direction, we don't really know which way we're going and how we're going to do things. And so I always use our way, or what we call a paradigm, to try to direct any kind of a work that I'm doing. And I'm privileged to know some of those things as Anishinaabe. And that's what we want to share with you a little bit about today, about our relationship in applying this paradigm and these ideas of how to do things and correct things and make things better for everybody through what people might call a Anishinaabe lens.
So we wanted to start off with a little bit of history and an acknowledgement to our wonderful collaboration we've had through our subject association, which is the First Nations Métis Inuit Education Association of Ontario, probably the longest title out there, and this growing relationship with Ian and the folks at OTF and the impacts that that's had. And we're going to speak a lot about this paradigm that Nancy mentioned, which is, respect, relationships, reciprocity, relational accountability. And I want to just provide one example before we dive in, to really to critically explore how do we get there, with some changes that happen in terms of these structures that have been in place that are actually harmful for Indigenous people. And actually, I would even say are harmful to everyone when we're locked into just one mode of doing things. And so, you may remember the good old days of the summer institutes that have been wiped out. Maybe we'll get back to those. But, in the beginning, they were offered, typically offered at a university, where you could stay in these dorms, and it would be housed out of a classroom for 3 days. And we said that that's not how we actually do things. And if you really want to understand what it means to be immersed in Indigenous education, the land has to be part of that. Like, you can't, like, this is always going to come back to the land. And we also have to come into communities. And part of that is that relationship building, because we are always combating this otherness, and how do you break down otherness? Well, you come together and you learn about each other. And so, in these conversations that we had back, several years ago, OTF was very gracious to say, okay, yeah, let's try this. Let's do things differently. And one of the other, so we were able to, so you're looking at some pictures here of, we bring people right into Nancy's community, right into her home, into her teaching lodge. And it's just a very, very different experience, getting out of the box that we often find ourselves in Western education. The other picture that you see here is the first ever institute for supporting language teachers. And, one thing I hope that you'll really take away from this, when we talk about reconciliation, is the restoration and the return of our languages that were brutally ripped away through the education system. And so really that should be the number one goal here, is what are we doing in our capacities, regardless of where we work? What are we doing to advance the goals of returning languages? And so we found ourselves up against a bit of a conundrum. Again, these problems in the system that in terms of access, many of the language teachers who were certified teachers were teaching on reserve and therefore didn't fall under the scope of being in the Federation. And so we were able to, because of a relationship that we had and a willingness from OTF to be creative and think outside the box, we were able to offer, through the work that we were doing in our end on the association end, cover the costs for teachers that were in federally funded schools to also have some access that the provincially funded teachers had access to. And so I just wanted to start off by saying these are these amazing outcomes that we can see when we do these things in this paradigm. But before we get to these wonderful feel-good moments, we have to go through some uncomfortable truths. And that's part of why we're here this morning, is to really lay the groundwork and the foundation, not to make you feel bad or to lay shame or guilt, but how can we work together to solve a problem if we don't really know what those problems are? And so we hope that through this session and even in our workshop this afternoon, that we're here to try and help for you to develop a critical lens to see what's happening with colonialism, because it is alive and well and really working. And when we're talking about that, we're also talking about power structures. And at the end of the day, who is making the decisions? So, we can try and get in at certain tables, but ultimately it's always somebody else making decisions on our behalf. And so before I speak any further, Nancy, do you want to speak to this? Do you want me to keep going?
Yeah, no, this is a really important slide because it sort of lays out what's ahead of us and who are making the decisions. And this has been really, really coming up this year when we think about the ministry and College of Teachers and school boards and faculties of education. And what I've been learning this year, because I do think quite a bit about colonialism and how we're going to get around it and how we're going to come through it, because I have grandchildren on the end of this. And what I have come to is that we keep reacting. And, I want to put a big shout out to the teachers and all the Indigenous leads and that, because we keep reacting to the same processes that have always been administered through the system onto us. And we have made huge gains sort of at the ground level and on the front lines. And we've been doing that for quite a few years. And my experience in working with education over the years, I'm starting to learn more about how that system operates. I'm not disciplined as a teacher, or I don't have a master's of education. Mine is in Indigenous knowledge and things like that. And so when I think about this, and what occurred to me this year was that our problem is we keep addressing colonialism with the same colonial processes and policies and practices and methods and meetings and all of those things. And this is no secret. I've been talking to the ministry about, we need to really consider, how do we change these processes? Who gets involved in these processes? Because what we're in is, on one hand, we could say there's a serious power imbalance here. And yeah, as an Indigenous person, I could say there's serious power imbalances from the ground up. But I really think that we really need to be looking deeper at how do we change these processes, and not just looking at it and not just hearing about it and not just acknowledging it, but really putting up front, in the front, committing to the resources and the process as it would be outlined by maybe through Indigenous knowledge. And so we would need translators, like myself, to say, no, that's a colonial thing. don't get offended at me, don't make it personal, but the way we've always administered things is you know, from a colonial way. And so we have to rethink how do we do this differently. And I think that's what you'll see through this presentation, is that we thought differently because of these things that I'm suggesting. And we've had some really great outcomes on the ground. And I feel like now our effort is to address these systems or this structure in the kindest, most humblest, respectful way, and say we have to do different, but we have to act on doing different.
So as we were coming up with our, you know, we were fine tuning our presentation for today. So we had to, in our conversation with Ian, so a little shout out. So we put a quote on there for you, Ian. But when we talk about truth and reconciliation, there's a reason why truth comes first. We have to sit in the discomfort. We have to take very hard, critical looks at ourselves and being complicit in it, because we are complicit in it. We're operating in a system that is still, it's designed in all of these levels, whether it's through the ministry, OCT, faculties of education, school boards, all those little cogs that are in this machine. It's still designed to cause harm for Indigenous students. And so we have to find out who's not muted. Who didn't mute themselves. Okay. So, but once we come to this knowing through this truth, then we have to put it into action. So what are we going to be committed to doing? And that's where, you know, that's where the real beauty and the excitement comes in, because we're talking about then transforming these harmful spaces. But again, as we go through this conversation, it always comes back to, we run into the problem with the power. Who's in control, who's ultimately making those decisions. So we're going to share a little story with you in regards to a shift in power at my school board, which I'm with the Dufferin Peel Catholic District School Board. And we call this the hook. So I'm going to turn it over to Nancy to talk about this, what you're looking at, which is actually, it might seem like, what is that? It is a hook, but it's actually, it's really profound in terms of a huge shift. And as a result of this shift has allowed us to really advance the goals of the truth and reconciliation, calls to action in our school board. It's led to what we're going to be sharing later, which is the first ever policy in the province on Indigenous education. But it kind of started with this moment.
So bonjour, Minwa, hi again. So what this hook represents is quite a bit of things. And it takes me back a few years before I worked with Jodie. I had worked with Dufferin Peel Catholic School Board for several years, one of the first school boards that I ever actually worked with. And in building that relationship before Jodie came in and on, it was pretty challenging. It was pretty taxing to try to really pull people out of the ideas that they had been taught and the practices that they had been taught and how to treat Indigenous people and things. So trying to be patient and guiding and educating on how to do things different. And because I am a treaty partner and a representative of our First Nation that stood up to represent in education, especially, I had been asked to come and do an opening to the board, the trustees of the board. And so I went and I did my thing. And when I walked into that boardroom, which was a place I wouldn't normally be in, I'd be in a classroom where we would be on the land doing things with teachers, PD and that on the land. And I'd walked into the boardroom. And what I saw in the boardroom was two full-size masks I guess in English they call them false face masks. And you wouldn't know by looking at me. You wouldn't know because I'm Anishinaabe. You wouldn't know that my husband comes from Six Nations, and we have children together. We've been married for 27 years, and I know about those masks, and I know about that because that is part of my husband's spiritual or religious, whatever you want to call those practices. And I know the protocols around those masks, and I know how they're supposed to be treated as sacred objects, et cetera, et cetera. And so I had some insight. I'll never speak on behalf of my husband's people, but we have two daughters, and they are mixed, Anishinaabe and Ongwehoi or Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, but we don't call me Iroquois anymore. And so I asked the lead at that time, I just mentioned, I said, I think that's inappropriate, and I think that you should take those down. And I really didn't even get an acknowledgement, the bustleness or whatever of this board meeting. So, I was harmed. I don't want to say I was harmed. I was feeling uncomfortable, but I did the work anyway, and I did what was necessary. And so a couple of years later, working with Jodie, who really listens to my ideas, and we just do great work together. Um, we had a Indigenous Education Council meeting, and this is our council that advises the lead and advises the board. And so there's I and other people who represent First Nation organizations, and I sit as a treaty partner and as a worker for the board. And I happened to be out in Mississauga, and my daughter happened to be with me, my youngest girl. And we went into to have our IAC meeting, and she started to get anxious. She was having a response to something, as a mother. She leans over to me and she says, "Mom," she says, "why do they got the Suduis up on the wall?" Because she belongs to that society. And so I said, "Babe," I says, I tried to get them to take them down, but they never. And because it was my daughter, I had to do something. I had to bring it to the table. And so I did. I went and talked to Jodie, and I said, Autumn's kind of freaking out because those masks are up on the wall, and they shouldn't be up there. And I didn't have a right to speak as Anishinaabe, but my daughter had every right. And she's a youth, and she's not going to tell this great big table that you are harming me by putting my spiritual and creed, and putting what represents my private life on display in a boardroom as a piece of art. And so, I went to Jodie, and it was very good, because it happened to be that also Ray John Oneida, uh, he also happened to be there. And we started to go through the things that we go through when we try to address these things. We start to go through, well, they were a gift to the board. They were an art gift to the board, several years ago. And in our way, we're honoring those people by putting these things on display. We're honoring that relationship by putting these things on display. And the other piece of that is that we start trying to validate this injustice. And so what happens is there starts into this negotiation. And all I could think is that, no, it has to come down. It has to come down. It took my daughter for me to see that, and wanting to protect my daughter from any kind of harms, regardless of the intent. The intent is great, but I don't want to talk about the intent. I want to talk about how that's harming my daughter, who's having a physical, visceral reaction to seeing, her ways of doing and being displayed on as art piece on the wall. And thank goodness for Ray John, and thank goodness for Jodie, because what Ray John said will always stay with me. And he said, this is not up for negotiation. They have to come down. And that was when they were taken down. This is why you're looking at an empty hook. But what I want to tell you is that we shouldn't have to take years, and it shouldn't depend on whose authority. It should depend on our authority. I did know a little bit about that, and those things should have come down at that time. And I can't imagine, I can only, make assumptions that other Indigenous people, knowingly or unknowingly, were harmed by these misrepresentations, regardless of where the intents come from. And so, to me, not for me, but justice was served for my daughter. But it took three of us, and it took negotiating, and it took too much time, essentially, to correct the injustice. And my daughter, we could, I would commend her for bringing that teaching forward, because it hadn't been addressed before. And so we could acknowledge her for at least having the courage to say, Mom, that isn't right. And I know it wasn't right. And I know Jodie knew it wasn't right. But what do we do when we're sitting in there and the power is so imbalanced and we know we're not going to listen? This is only one example of what Indigenous people go through on a daily basis, every day. And it's not that we're desensitized to it. If you've ever heard that term, death by 1,000 cuts, that's what it is like to walk through systems and institutions and society in Canada today, is that we see it everywhere, we feel it everywhere, but there is not no address to it. There's no redress to it. There's no listening because of these power imbalances and what influences people. And so this hook means so many things. But for me and my daughter and my grandchild that she just had, this hook means justice. That's what it means for us.
Thank you, Nancy. So I really want to emphasize, I want people to really hold on to the fact that there was a negotiation happening. Why was there a negotiation? Because of who is the decision maker ultimately. So in the school board, although we have quite a powerful Indigenous Education Council now, ultimately it's still superintendent, director, and up the chain. This is still the case when we talk about the ministry. Who's writing the curriculum? And remember, if you remember to what Nancy was saying, oh, it was a gift, because we hear this as part of the resistance as well. Oh, but an Indigenous person said it was okay. Oh, but I could go and find somebody that would say, oh yeah, it's okay to hang masks up, because there's a huge difference. Really knowing who's grounded in their cultural practices, their language, the community, and who's not. And this is part of the problem, especially in these, especially in Southern Ontario particularly, is that who are we engaging with? Who are we consulting with? Are we consulting with the right people? Because we can't just say, oh, I asked an Indigenous person and they said it was okay. It has to, there needs to be levels of integrity and assurances that it's not just one person that's speaking on behalf of all nations either. And so I go back to, when we talked about the previous slide, just before we move on, I just want to go back and mention something. I worked at the College of Teachers, and I can tell you those AQ courses, if I was saying something was problematic in them, but others didn't agree, it's like, oh, 3 against 1. Therefore, your concern isn't valid. Who's the decision makers ultimately? Who's deciding what the policy is going to state in terms of how it plays out at the Faculty of Education, in terms of how it plays out in school boards or even at the federation level. So it's always going to come back to this, what we were saying is there's a power imbalance. And so we all have to work together to shift that imbalance. And when we come forward as Indigenous people, and you're going to see this more and more again, there was just a big thing in the news again, and this is not going to go away. This is just going to be more of, because as Indigenous peoples find our voices and are equipped with the language and become more supported, these things are going to be surfaced as they should, because what we're going to be getting into with this presentation is ultimately these are, you're breaking the law. These are human rights violations. So how do we get to, so in order to see what's causing harm, and Nancy mentioned intention versus impact. When you're dealing with a human rights case, intention doesn't come into it. That's not a grounds for getting off on a legal harm that's been caused. So let's take a real look at one of the biggest things I think that we see harming us in education is the romance. There is such a romance towards Indigenous people's spirituality, customs, culture. And so this is where these intention, oh, but my intention was to honor you. My intention was to, bring in a representation. But are you though? Or are you bringing in another white version representation of what white people think Indigenous people are? Because that's how it keeps coming out. So we've had, because we're doing this work in our board, we're actually getting stuff brought back, which is good. You can see this picture down in the bottom corner. This was brought in by a principal to our office. Like, this thing is massive too. It doesn't do it justice in the picture. Like, this is and he was saying he didn't notice for years it hung on the wall in the school. And he walked by it and never noticed. And then it was after one of our sessions, he actually stopped, looked at it very closely and went, oh my God, this is really bad, and brought it in. So, this is so, can you imagine, again, as Nancy was saying, kids are in a power imbalance to begin with in our systems. They're up against adults. They're not necessarily going to tell you, I don't feel right about what's happening here, but they're definitely going home and talking about it. I hear it from my kids, but they're not in a position to call it out, nor should they be. And so what we're asking educators to do is really start to deeply examine what's been going on and change our practice. And nothing is static. Things are constantly going to be changing. What we did 5 years ago may have seemed okay, but every time we learn something more, we change it. That's what we do as reflective practitioners in this profession. We do this with everything else. We don't ever, write our very first lesson plan and then keep doing that same one over and over and over. Of course not. Usually our first lesson plan is like, ooh, that was a start, but I could do much better. And so we change it, we take out things that aren't working and we bring in better things. We have to do this, but on a much greater scale, because we're talking about human dignity, human rights, and Indigenous rights as well. So Nancy, over to you for this.
Yeah, it's just for sort of an FYI slide. We could probably do a whole presentation and stories and unpacking and strategies around every bullet in the slide, but just taken as an overall piece to start moving. My background is political science and Indigenous rights and international law, and you might wonder what that would have to do with education. And so, when we're thinking about who we should be talking to, we want to talk to experts. If we want to decolonize, we should talk to people who have dedicated, their personal life and maybe their professional life and their academic life to decolonization. And, that's one of the things where we're really, I'm talking about this system that just keeps perpetuating itself and it can't address the issues. We have to hire the people who are actually the people. And so, we have to, I always recommend, and I'll do it here too. I always say, stay out of my culture. I don't need you in my, I don't need anybody in my culture. That doesn't mean I don't like my culture. It doesn't mean I don't like the way that we do things. What I'm saying is that we're not going to, you know, we're not going to craft our way out of colonialism. So instead of studying the crafts and the culture, and they're beautiful things, we're completely missing these things on here where we should be studying, so that we can actually cause change. And so, and thinking about that leads us into talking about human and indigenous rights. So there's a lot of talk now about equity and inclusion, but there's not a lot of understanding that indigenous peoples are not equity seeking people. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be deserving the same fundamental basic human rights as every other person in this country, but we also have our indigenous rights, and indigenous rights are different by, for many reasons. Now that we could do a whole workshop on this, but we have to understand basically that a lot of these infringements are specific to harming indigenous rights as well as human rights. And so this is where we brought in, and this was not my idea. So you could flip the next slide, Jodie, if you want. Um, so this didn't come from me. I work with elders. I listen to elders. I believe in elders, and I will do whatever. I will work my butt off, trying to do whatever they tell us to do. And even our organization is set up like that. I said, I can't work for this if we don't have an elders council, because I need that direction. I want to know their vision. I have knowledge, but they have wisdom, and those are two very different things. And so, I had a chance to sit with James Anaya, who you can Google up. He's a great guy. And he was one of the creators on the UNTRIP, along with Sharon Helen Van and Wilton Littlechild, who you also may or may not know, but, check these people out. And later, James Anaya was here, and we were doing a similar thing for Ontario Human Rights Commission. And I asked him, I said, James, I work in education. I believe it has the most promise for helping our people and things like that. And I said, what do you recommend that I do? And, we're talking, TRC exists, and, we have the recommendations from there. He said, what he told me is that the UNDRIP is the framework for reconciliation. So we have the TRC, and we know just by the recent reports, it's not really getting very far, but we also have the UNDRIP. And the UNDRIP will not only educate you about Indigenous rights, but it also tells us how to protect them, And so we took this UNDRIP based on, he's an elder, based on James Anaya. And I took these ideas to Jodie, and I said, what about this when we're thinking systemically, when we're thinking about your board, or we're thinking about the province, how can we do something? And we were told also by our elders council, educate people about the UNDRIP. And so, I do a lot of that. We do a lot of that. And it's so, I was going to get going on it, but that's for another session. So it talks about some fundamental things like that, to translate for you: consultation and consent. So if you're going to teach Indigenous education, or you're going to develop courses, or whatever you're going to do, are you consulting the proper experts? Are you bringing in your treaty partner? I'm big on that treaty partner piece. What is it that they desire? What is it that they want to see reflected? How do we humanize them? Because we continue to develop things on behalf of Indigenous people, like, AQ courses and things like that. We continue to make those decisions without having the proper people at the table. And what I mean by proper people, this could be several people. This could be an elder who was put forward by the treaty partner. This could be, somebody like myself, an education, expert put forward by the treaty partner. And what is it that we want to see? And have we garnered consent? consent is a very important thing, because we have a lot of extractivism. So we hear a teaching, we're reproducing it somewhere else. Well, that shows a clear misunderstanding of how Indigenous knowledge is transmitted in accordance with Indigenous protocols, accountabilities, accreditation, and those kind of things. The other piece is free, prior, and informed consent. Have we informed the Indigenous people exactly what we're going to be doing, even if it's just talking about the use of a medicine wheel, things like that. And so the declaration, very important for us to understand, and we've gone ahead and we've pulled some. Now the entire declaration is relevant to education, but we've pulled some specifics just to display them, alert you to them. Yeah.
And I want to just add to that too, to say that in terms of the consultation piece, consultation alone does not equal consent. And I also want to really highlight the extraction piece, because I think part of the issue is that as educators, we are taught to extract. Like, that's what we're trained to do. And so we have to not apply that in this area. For example, we are taught, we go to PDs, conferences, things like this, and we take, because that's what we're supposed to, right? And then what can I take out of this so I can replicate it in my class tomorrow? But a lot of what we're doing and what we're seeing is, you can come and learn for your own self to become more informed, but that doesn't necessarily mean you go back and replicate and repeat. And a lot of these problems come about because of this. And the other piece I want to speak to is also that just because you've been given consent doesn't mean it's lifelong. So at some point, maybe things are is okay. But if somebody, for example, if Nancy comes to me and says, like, 5 years ago, I was okay with this, but I've been thinking about this and things have changed, or maybe we're revising something, we just went through a revision of something. I don't want to have that in there anymore. It comes out, and it's not negotiable. It just comes out because that's the right thing. That's what you're supposed to do. So on this note, so we're going to, dive into some examples of like what it should not look like and what it can look like. But I want you to really remember, when you're talking about Indigenous peoples, what is, we talk about, I have a granddaughter now as well, so here we have our grandchildren are coming up into the system. How are they going to see themselves in your spaces? Will they see themselves as coming from diverse, incredibly sophisticated, complex societies and nations or civilizations? Do they see that, or do they see nothing? Or do they see some bizarre representation, like what Nancy was saying with the crafts and stuff? Or do we continue to minimalize complex knowledge systems in this way? And that's all we ever see is maybe, we're steeped in medicine wheels, and that's problematic too. It's one of those things when we talked about culturally responsive pedagogy, it's the same thing. We tried it, we brought it in because there was nothing happening. So we brought in this culture, and now we're seeing that that kind of backfired in a lot of ways, because so many people are caught up in the bias of the romance and get attached to it and really have a hard time letting go. So let's talk about this Article 15 about having the right to dignity and diversity and proper consultation to eliminate discrimination. So in 8.1, not to be subjected to forced assimilation. So we see a lot of smudge kits. You can buy smudge kits. Everybody wants to smudge because it's trendy. But do you know actually, like, have you actually been given the permissions to do these things? And I'll tell you, for my kids, and I know Nancy will speak to it from her side, they're not comfortable experiencing other people mimicking and doing these things, again, out of the guise of, oh, but it's well-intentioned. I'm just trying to, like, bring in an Indigenous thing, but it's actually causing harm. Back to you, Nancy.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna not much to speak to this, but you know, there are I know our world, and I know what I don't want to see in classrooms. And for my grandchildren, I also know what my daughters went through experiencing both federal and provincial education. And so we're what might be called a ceremonial family. And you know, that is not up for public display or things like that. And so, you know, I take criticisms both sides, but I say I don't want the seven grandfathers posters on walls. I don't want to see medicine wheels in there. If I approach a teacher or someone about that, that's not up for negotiation. I'm the grandmother, he's the grandfather. We will teach them how to be Anishinaabe, and we will teach them how to be Ongwehoi. And it is time for us to shift out of that. There's lots of, you know, reasons why we shouldn't do this, but just in the interest of the times that we have here, we should just stay out of the culture altogether until we know how to do things, and not even until we know how to do things properly. Because if you are not immersed in that world, you'll never be able to do it properly. And so you're going to come across people like myself, and this is it. You know, it's setting. I don't know how to explain it to you, but we just have to stop. There's more important things going on than trying to display how Indigenous people do things. And I think this is a good place where we could start. And this is such a time waster. Like, honestly, I work with several boards, and you know, if we could just take care of appropriation and romance, my goodness, the work that we could get done, so that we don't have to put out all these, you know, appropriation fires until everybody starts to understand that this is wrong. Stop doing it. Let's focus on what needs to be really done, the real issues. So yeah. So don't be offended if I say take it down. Don't do it. Just don't be offended. Just do it.
So
So this
what,
next section, just so
yeah.
you understand, we're displaying an article. We're displaying, you know, sort of an example of abuse of those articles, and then we're proposing you a solution. And so this is how we can get around, you know, the seven ground forest medicine wheel teachings and all this cultural appropriation.
So we have in
Go
our
ahead,
board,
Joyce.
yeah, we have a what we call a visiting elders program. And so again, it's primary source, it's the people, bring the people, let the people speak for themselves. And there's a huge range and diversity in terms of knowledge, even language. And again, just to use the seven grandfathers as the example, when you put those posters up, what are you saying to the Inuit children that might be in your class? What are you saying to the Ongahongwe kids that that's not their thing? Like there's, so, you know, and how many people are familiar with Chief Shingwak? How many people are familiar with Pontiac, Tecumseh, Oshawanu? Like these are we like what are we teaching? We're getting sidetracked on the romance, but we're not bringing in these like we talk about, you know, Johnny McDonald, but we're not talking about any of these significant Indigenous people who have shaped the fabric of our society. So, you know, we have to think about what we're focusing on and bring in the people to do that. The other thing is providing access and opportunity. So we have, again, just using my board as the example. So we have an Indigenous Student Council. We run, you know, the culture is for us as for Indigenous people, the culture and those customary practices are meant to, we are steep our kids in this, Indigenous youth, because this is their birthright. This is what they're supposed to have access to is these things. So again, from what I said before, what are you doing to provide access and opportunity to language, access to elders and other knowledge keepers? Did you want to speak to any of this or next? Or
No, go ahead. We're gonna run out of time. We're
so,
Western versus Indigenous
I know.
time.
One of the things, so one of the other things, and again, we talk a lot about this, is what is the redress? So what are we doing about when we find things that are problematic? So again, I'm going to use my school board as the example. So we discovered that the grade 11 world religion course, hugely problematic. It's a complete violation of human rights and Indigenous rights. With respect to, originally it was called the Aboriginal Spirituality Unit, then it was the Native Spirituality Unit, then it was, I think, an FNMIEAO. Don't acronym, just on a little tangent there. Don't acronym FNMI, because you're dehumanizing people when you put them in an acronym. Then it was Indigenous Spirituality. Anyway, regardless, it had things in there like do an assignment where you pretend you go on a vision quest and meet a spirit animal, and like it was really gross. So what we said was remove it, take it out. And what we replaced it with was a unit where teachers could critically explore the impacts of religion on Indigenous peoples, do a critical exploration of the papal bulls, because they're still on the books. Like that, the Doctrine of Discovery and Terra Nullius is still legally the foundation of the Constitution of Canada that has real impacts for Indigenous peoples' rights. And so how, and again, I said at the beginning, how do we address harm when we don't have a solid, firm understanding as to what is causing it? So the more that we become informed and knowledgeable about what's going on with these things, then we can actually take concrete steps to redress and fix it, so that kids no longer are feeling awful in classrooms, so that kids feel resilient, so that kids feel that they have a place and that they feel valued and that they see hope for themselves as well. Again, like we, as our association, we raised huge concerns with the new health curriculum, because again, heavy reference to over romanticized health practices and a huge miss on other more important things that could be talked about in terms of health practice. And so, again, we see like, the focus again on smudging. Like, these are things like, this doesn't, like, why? These are things that belong in our lodges. It's almost like, when they say keep the religion out of the state, like these are things that belong to Indigenous people. There's no need. We're not, like Nancy was saying, we're not actually addressing the real racism that's ongoing. All we're doing is encouraging teachers to partake in these practices, and then they're going to find themselves at the end of a human rights tribunal. So, we're also trying to say this to like help teachers not get into those predicaments as well. So that's why we keep saying over and over, just stay out of that realm. Just, there's so much to focus on and to do. Just stay out of there. Sorry, I know I went on a tangent on that one. Sorry, Nancy. Anything else on that?
It's okay. I'm handling the chat.
Okay.
We're gonna run out of time.
I know. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm trying to answer as much questions in the chat as I can. But this speaks to us when there's lots of questions like this, and we're like barely halfway through our presentation. What this tells me is there's so much more time and effort that needs to be dedicated to these things that we're talking about. And so, just to place that in your mind and think about that is that we need time. We need time to sit down. We have just a little bit of a glimpse of time, but place that in your mind that we have to take time, take the time to learn about all of these things that we need to learn about, to do things, Giidaakunadaad and Chagay, to set it up right and to go forward properly.
So again, we have, Nancy mentioned an elders council. So our association operates with the Elders Advisory Council. These are individuals from across Ontario. Almost the majority of them are residential school survivors. Many of them are still fluent language speakers despite of that. They really are the ones. So when we put things out as FNMIEAO, and we have heaps and heaps of resources that will keep you busy for years. When we put these things out, they're all vetted so that you can be assured that if you're using our resources, you're going to be okay. Just stay with these sections. And again, what are you teaching about? We want to know the true history of Canada, not the propaganda one that's been put forward. What do the treaties? How well versed are you in treaties? Spend time learning about that. And then contributions is such a huge one. And again, what are you doing? What are you showing about knowledge systems? Is it sophisticated? Are you talking about knowledge systems like they're like quantum physics and mathematics? Because we have a whole other initiative on that. Or are you, again, minimizing and tokenizing? Are you showing the incredible resistance and resiliency of Indigenous peoples as incredible role models for kids? Lots and lots of things there. Just moving on. And most importantly, building a relationship. It takes time. It took us, we got here like what, 150 years to get to this point where it's not going to happen overnight. You have to invest in the time. Do you want to speak to any of this, Nancy? And then we'll just really quickly highlight the policy.
You keep going to.
Okay.
Yeah, you keep going. I'm trying to answer questions in the chat.
Okay, great. So building the relationship. So taking the time. This year, we have to go on a learning journey. We have to take the time to unlearn. Because remember, everyone, this isn't just about Indigenous peoples. Everyone has been impacted by colonialism and continues to be. As a Canadian, you've been robbed of the truth about this country. You should be really upset about that. Take the time to find out why we see things in the news like land back. Take the time to look at why do we hear such horrific stereotypes that continue to be portrayed around Indigenous people, such as, oh, they just get everything for free. Why do they still complain? Like these are, there's some real foundational truths that you need to be exposed to. Start to ask questions. I encourage teachers to, in my board, like just ask if you're doing something or experience something and your gut says, listen to that. It's probably telling you that something's not right here and that you need to investigate that more. Humility. We have to be humble about this and really think about, our education system was designed specifically to take our youth and turn them into compliant factory workers, basically. Don't ask questions, do as I say, and become like this, and participate in the consumer-based, corporate-driven economy, which is actually tied, we can't get into that today, but that global climate change is directly related to our consumer-based economy, which is directly related to colonization, which is directly related to the theft of lands and the destruction of Indigenous peoples. Like these are all working together. So we need to, this takes time. And when you do this, and when you take the time to get to know, depending on where you live or where you're at, get to know your local communities, the people, and do that work, because it pays off in enormous ways when you do that collaboration. Nancy and I have been working together for 10 years. We didn't just one day arrive at this point where we're talking about things together. Like this has been a long journey to get to this point. So very quickly, just to kind of end off on where we are at in our board and what other boards are now in the process of doing, and what we hope to see more going on throughout the province is, again, our system change has happened because of a relationship, because of trust that's been built over time. And through this consultation process, we developed these guiding principles, and again, that are all aligned and based on the UNDRIP. We also, because we're in a Catholic board, we also tied in the importance of our fundamental belief as a Catholic school board is the inherent human dignity of all people. How do we hold that up and ensure that human dignity is being held intact by doing these things? We talk about, we have a Catholic social teaching called subsidiarity. We say, there's a saying that says, nothing about us without us. That's what subsidiarity means. It means we're not making decisions on behalf of other people. The people who which this is impacted makes those decisions. And so these guiding principles, this is what it first looked like. We called it in the beginning, promising practices, but this column here really has what's turned into what we call the GAP, or the general administrative procedures, what we expect to see happening. And you can see we've aligned it here with the UNDRIP, or the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We also aligned it with the calls to action. The Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. Calls to action. Action, doing something. Most of those calls, 94 calls to action, are actually based on education and awareness. So that's what it started as. And again, Indigenous peoples are the guardians and interpreters. They have the right to exercise, control, and protect. So when Nancy says, take the mask off the wall, we go to the wall, we remove the mask right away. No questions, right? When we find out that there are bins, and there were bins in schools that actually had masks in them, drums in them, pipes in them, like, oh, we said those come back immediately. And that's what we did. No questions but we've had them for so long. But we've never had anybody complain about them. But no more buts. This is just this, like the honeymoon is over, to quote Nancy, as she always says. We need to get down to business, and we have to really be serious about this. And like I said, when we do this with that paradigm of relationships, reciprocity, respect, relational accountability, this is what can happen. And so we were very, very excited. It was kind of like a anticlimactic moment. You work on years for something, and then it just passed, and like no big woo or anything. Just it's passed. But this, and we got this in like 3 days before March break last year. Remember that? After March break lockdown. So we were lucky to kind of get it in there. So now, and again, I just want to point this out here too, is that remember, Indigenous people's rights are protected by, look at all these laws, in addition to Indigenous laws, which we didn't even get. That's a whole 3D presentation. So, just in case you weren't sure, we listed these all off here as well. And, like I said, with the gap, yep, go ahead. Go, Nancy, yeah.
So I've been doing a lot of work because this is the movement. The movement is to get a policy, an Indigenous education policy, and there's several things that are lining up that movement. But what I want to be very clear about here is that you cannot take one policy from one board and transfer it into another, because that's what we've been asked to do. Oh, you developed a policy. Can we just have a copy of yours? And we say no, and that's not control, that's not greediness. What that is we really, really advocating. This is a process that needs to be gotten through with your local First Nation, your treaty partner, the inherent rights holders, your education experts, so that policy is developed specific to your board. So we went after the appropriation first. And so that was very important to have in this policy. Other boards have other problems, right? They have problems with, maybe racism from, the admin down to the people. We're going to want to look at that. So what I'm saying is that it's not about the product. what it is. It's about the process. All the work that we do is about that process, that and let's set it up right. Let's take the time to think it through, right? Let's have the right people at the table. Let's sort it out. This will prevent us from keep making the same mistakes that we've been making. And so, yes, it's not the product. It's, I shouldn't have looked at the chat now, I'm reading the chat. But just so that people know, because, and this is the same down to lesson plans, all kinds of things, is that the board should be doing the work, and they should be doing it in collaboration, in relationship with the proper experts and the proper Indigenous people, because you're going to come out with a great product. And what this product looks to, what do you call it, supports in our work, is accountability. Now we have something to reach every single teacher. You know what that means to me? That means, oh my gosh, I am going to be put out of a job someday, which looks so inviting to me, but we're scaling it out. And so just to leave you with that, it's about the process. It's not about the product that gets produced.
I want to also,
Jodie,
there's a
sorry.
really important comment in the chat box. I know we have like 1 minute left, but I want to address this, that in terms of mixed messaging. So I want you to think about many people, elders especially, they're not experiencing the day-to-day education and how this plays out in the classroom. And I mentioned this before with this whole notion of culturally responsive pedagogy. Our elders are beautiful, and they want nothing but people to understand the beauty of who they are. But what they probably aren't realizing is that how it gets taken up and how it gets twisted around and then comes out backwards in classrooms. It's not that we don't want people to know about the beauty of our culture and who we are, but the problem is that we're being distracted by that, and we're not getting to dealing with actually being anti-racist teachers. We want to be anti-racist teachers. It's not to say that, and so there's a, Nancy, I know you want to, I know you want to speak to that as too. So I want to.
Yeah. So what I'm being asked here, I'll translate this for you, Sabrina. What you're asking me to do is to advise on somebody else's territory. I don't know the elders that you're speaking of. I don't even know the territory that you're speaking of. I don't know if those are treaty partners and they have decided that these are the workshops that should be delivered for your board from their community. And so I will never speak against another Indigenous person. So it's not to ask me to say what Nancy says has weight down there. I'll tell you, in my board, in the board that, or not my board, but my territory, I do have a very respected and you know, formal and informal voice around what we should be seeing in my treaty territory. So if those workshops were in collaboration and delivered and facilitated by your treaty partner, then, you know, if your treaty partner is saying that we want you to know this, then that is good. That means you've properly consulted, you've received consent, and the treaty partner is saying, we want the children in this school board to know about our culture. I cannot speak to that. I would be outside of my jurisdiction to do that. So what happens here is that we actually take a West way of dealing things, and we sort of implant that over onto Indigenous way of dealing things. What I'm sharing with you is the Indigenous way. So I will not answer that question because it is not my jurisdiction to speak about what elders are teaching over in these workshops. And you know, this is a huge issue, but please don't do that to us by trying to justify things from another nation with another nation. And maybe that's the fundamental teaching, all the way back to free, prior, and informed consent and who's being consulted. Does that help? Okay. Yeah, so I will never speak against elders.
Yeah, no.
What Jodie was saying was 100% true. I work with them all my life. They're never going to tell you no, because they're operating from love and kindness. They will not tell you no, even when it's called mono. It means don't interfere. And remember, I said there's a difference between wisdom and knowledge. That is wise. What we're talking about here is about knowledge and education. I don't know if there is anybody in here. I know I'm not wise, but I do know where elders are coming from by experience. Thank you.
Yeah. So I just want to thank everyone for listening this morning to our presentation. And if you have any questions, I'll put up our contact slide. And I noticed I saw in the show in the chat box, shout out to my co-chair, my partner for FNMIEAO, Natalka. She's our language co-chair. So I just want to shout out to Natalka, who's out there. I saw your name pop up in the chat box. So, and you know, the work that we do, again, is guided by elders who advise us. And so what we share with you is what they share with us. It's their hopes and visions and dreams in terms of how do we get this right moving together, because we are all in this together. So again, thank you.
So I'll let you leave that slide up there so that people know how to reach you. Nancy and Jodie, on behalf of the steering committee and all the participants at the symposium today, I'd like to echo how I began with Chimi Gwetch. Thank you very much for sharing both your personal and professional experience and journeys with us, and just reminding us that for you as well, it's a process, not a product. You talked about, on one of your last slides there, Murray Sinclair's comment about, education got us into this mess and education will get us out. And certainly you're both agents of action and change. And you were modeling, going back to your title, the idea of working together and setting things up right. So you were also trying to grapple with the mechanics of addressing what was on the screen, but also in the chat box. So congratulations on successfully, I think, navigating that. So you've reminded us that this is all of our work working together, and that we have a responsibility in this space called the present that lands us between 7 generations back and 7 generations still to come. And the idea that truth is a noun, reconciliation, which I almost tripped up, and I always call it reconciliation as a verb. So you've given us both insights and ideas and tools to help us in that journey. I think you've left us with some answers, but also some of their questions, and both of those things are equally valuable and leaving us lots to process. And I'll end the gratitude with this. So we might be in the middle of winter, but for a brief and important moment when autumn was with us. So with that, I'm going to just remind us that we're moving to break.